Hi, my name is Timothy Lodice, and today I'm going to do a brief presentation about the unique attitudes and acceptance of the Soviet Union and communism during the early 1930s. And it's unique because you don't see throughout the life of the Soviet Union such a positive look at the Soviet Union that many Americans held during the time. The 1930s is my chosen area of expertise. I find it to be a very interesting period, and I often write about it. Although this is not the subject for my final project for this class, nor my dissertation that I'm working on, which is about the great banking crisis in Europe in 1931, which I argue is a more accurate starting point for the Great Depression than the stock crash of 1929, and how Americans of the time really didn't view an economic calamity going on until unemployment soared during that period. That was when it first went over 10%, and it stayed over 10% unemployment until the end of 1940, early 1941. Just as a view of how uniquely bad the economic situation was in the 1930s, we only hit, in the post-World War II era, all those years, about 80 years or so, we only hit 10% briefly twice, once in 1982, once in 2009, and it was only for a month's period of time. Not 1930s, it was a whole decade of being above. Much of the time, it was well above 10%, even above 20% some of the time. The peak was 1933. It hit what we estimate today to be about 25%. About 1 out of 4 people who were looking for any kind of work couldn't find a job at all. And those show just what makes it unique, and uh, it was a very dangerous time. More and more Americans were accepting more radical ideas or solutions for the country's economic problems, and that's what brings me to this topic today. Great book regarding this subject. It was written in 1950 by a journalist slash historian from England called Alistair Cook, and he wrote a book called "The Generation on Trial." And it was ostensibly about the Alger Hiss trials in the House Un-Americans Activities Committee. But the more general theme was how it wasn't fair in the new hated attitude towards the Soviet Union that took place in the early Cold War to be judging the ideas and philosophies people had in the 1930s, which was a very different political climate in the United States. And he was right. It was very different than any other time in regards to attitude towards the Soviet Union. Uh, Although in the very beginning, after World War I, there was a very hostile attitude towards the Soviet Union, resulting in the first Red Scare. After the Great Famine of 1920 and 21, a famine which actually killed more people in Russia than the war did, was a complete crop failure in their main agricultural region. It was devastating. But they were able to somehow regain order after that, and it did gain a certain sympathy with some people. And after that, you saw gradually a more accepting attitude of many Americans towards the Soviet Union. Not by any means. People like Herbert Hoover and many others blamed every riot, every labor disturbance as being started by communists, whether that was true or not. And there was a lot of what they called red baiting by the Hearst newspapers, meaning just blaming problems on subversive communist activities. But in much of the journalism and literature, you see uh, writers being more active in promoting the Soviet Union. After FDR recognized the Soviet government in 1933 and opened diplomatic relations, you saw a flood of people visiting the Soviet Union, writing about the Soviet Union, and many of it was very positive, surprisingly. And the actual recognition itself was very controversial because of the Comintern, which was a Russian subsidized agency which was actively promoting revolution around the world and for people to overthrow their governments and replace them with communist governments. And this was a major barrier to recognition. But in 1933, the economy was so bad that we were looking for any new avenues of trade and ways to increase employment. So Roosevelt decided to recognize Russia in spite of the Comintern, even though not very much trade took place until World War II. But anyway, writers like George Saul Jr., who was the editor for the New Republic, wrote books such as The Coming American Revolution, where he actively promoted communism as a great future alternative for America, and how this communist system taking place in Russia was a wave of the future, and that it should be embraced by the American people as an inevitable step of American society. He also participated in the 1933 May Day Parade, which was largely attended by communists and socialists at the time. And newspapers caught him raising the Communist salute and singing the Third International. And this was something that could not have been done probably 10 years earlier, certainly not 15 years later. Other authors, such as Thelma Nordenberg, who wrote The New Red Freedom, echoed these sentiments. She also wrote a serial for a syndicate of newspapers called Inside the Soviet, where she traveled to the Soviet Union, and she wrote about life there in these glowing, unrealistic terms, as it was almost a paradise over there. She wrote about topics such as housing and how there's no homeless people in Russia. Everyone has a roof over their head, and how women have been liberated there and have the same rights as men and are treated great, and just these false positive notions about how there's no big problems in the Soviet Union, everything's going great. And she just briefly mentions that the government is oppressive in some aspects, but she says that this is justified because of all the progress they're making, completely ignoring the many purges that took place and the executions for petty crimes such as hoarding money, which is subject to be executed. But this was the literature being released to the American people and changing American ideas about the Soviet Union. This was also seen in many films of the era where the Sovietism and communism was viewed as comic relief in many films. Example of this is a movie called Heroes for Sale, 1933. The main character has a best friend called Max, who's a communist and goes around arguing with people about the benefits of communism, annoying people, I should say. And for example, one scene he's arguing with the old man about the benefits of communism versus capitalism, and he asks the old man, "Well, what benefits has capitalism given to society?" And he says, "Well, people are living longer." And Max replies, "Yes, but that only prolongs their suffering under the capitalist oppression." And it's things like that used for comic relief, things that would definitely be unacceptable post World War II and era of McCarthy. Another film is it's called The Merry Franks from 1934. It shows an oddball family, and one of the oddball members of the family is a Communist Party leader who's always inviting these Russians into the house. And in his room, he has a giant portrait of Joseph Stalin. And, I guess people in the 30s, that was viewed as being funny, maybe making fun of communist agitators people might have encountered. But that certainly would not have been funny in 1950. And perhaps the best example is a movie of 1933 called Clear All Wires, about a journalist who goes to Russia to write about what's going on there. And it shows various comical situations about life in Russia, like the newly liberated woman, the newly prosperous peasant. Just very light-hearted view of the Soviet Union. One scene I actually have him wandering about the Kremlin looking for an interview with Joseph Stalin, and he happens to bump into him finally, and they superimpose his image, and him and Stalin are waving to the Soviet troops marching in Red Square. And this is just comedy. But in seriousness, there were a lot of people that were concerned about all this promotion of communism among the younger generation. There was a serious problem in the early 30s. Young teenagers roaming the country in freight cars looking for work. They weren't being rebellious. They just lived in families where their parents lost their jobs and were struggling to put food on the table. And rather than stay home and be a burden, many of them chose to go around the country trying to find any work they could. And there was a great book written by a sociology professor from the University of Minnesota called Thomas Meinham. And he, being in his 30s, he dressed up as a hobo and tried to mingle with these teenagers roaming the country and find out about them. And what he wrote was fairly disturbing to people at the time. He wrote that they largely embraced communism and were, his words, many of them were anti-American, anti-capitalist, and anti-religion. And he wrote how he worried about the future of America because he said these young people showed no more allegiance to American society than to the South Pole, in his words. And the troubling lifestyle they lived, how they found no problem with stealing food and clothing from people around the country as a legitimate way to get by in life. And he said that many of them had an attitude that their parents had it better than them, and that the world owes them something for the conditions that are going on, the life they're coming into. And this is just a reflection of the way the young people at the time were being wooed by these new communist ideas. In fact, many communist propaganda films were being shown in movie theaters which specialized in foreign films. They were viewed as movies, but they were largely just propaganda, and they were meant to show how life is better in the Soviet Union. Many of them showed people working, or a film about a peasant who lived a rough life before the revolution and is now living a great life. And this was part of what people had to deal with in the 1930s. But as more information came out and things improved in the United States, Stalin gradually, the Soviet Union gradually waned in popularity until the Cold War completely collapsed. And it was basically illegal to be a communist in the United States at that point. But just wanted to give some examples of the unique outlook people had toward communism during their early and hardest days of the Great Depression. And I thank everyone for watching this, and have a great day and stay healthy out there.